Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Space is the Place, The Lives and Times of Sun Ra, by John Szwed, narrated by Leon Nixon. Our music is a secret order. Louis Armstrong, 1954. Preface. When I first heard Sun Ra's music in 1966, it seemed a bit strange to me. But in retrospect, I think it was not so much the music itself that was so odd, but its lack of context and information. The recordings I heard were on ESP Records, and every one of that company's long-playing albums was then packaged with a black and white starkness that hinted at the music's obscurity, coming from who knows where. Even the company's name was unclear. ESP meant extrasensory perception? Maybe, but it might have been Esperanto, since there were a few words in that constructed international language on some of the back covers. Sun Ra's recordings on his own Saturn Records albums first appeared in 1957 but were exceedingly difficult to find, their existence and distribution as mysterious as the rest of Ra's life. The albums were assembled by a strange sense of order. They often mixed together recordings made at rehearsals, in studios, and in different years, then were labeled as having the same dates, or with the wrong personnel, so that the Arkestra might appear to be playing in widely divergent styles. Their covers were often hand-drawn, titled with a magic marker, sometimes with wrong titles or none at all, may be labeled as being in solar high fidelity, or registered with interplanetary BMI. There might be no dates. They used erratic numbering, and the names of the leader and the band changed over time. Later, other Saturns might have elaborate and colorful artwork, with the whole album wrapped in a transparent scrap of an old shower curtain. But never was there a decipherable clue to what their contents might sound like. That same sense of wonderment and dislocation was magnified once I saw the Arkestra live. Its performances in the late 1960s and 1970s could be mystifying and even scary. The exotic, the down-home, eccentric, hip, archaic, and the freaky could come at the audience in overlapping waves. Whether at Swarthmore College or Slug's Saloon on East 3rd Street in New York, performances could begin in total darkness. And as the lights slowly came up, there were revealed acrobats, dancers streaming baticked silks, the band chanting, marching, and bunny-hopping, like astronauts on the moon, through the audience in Egypto-space clothes, a drummer yelling into his cymbals, two baritone saxophonists battling musically and physically, and the maestro himself in his cockpit/pulpit playing an electric keyboard, sometimes with his back to the keyboard, his fingers upside down on the keys, sometimes with his butt. All of this enacted in front of a silent movie of the band capering among the pyramids of Egypt. Was it vaudeville? Circus? A happening? Hell's a poppin'? Wagnerian Gestamtkunstwerk? The closest thing to Sun Ra in that time period was a Hungarian theater group that came to New York City in 1977, moved into a storefront, and called it Squat Theater. The group's performances erased the line between theater and reality by means that could confuse and shock even hardcore off-Broadway regulars who lived to not be surprised. The Squat's audiences watched the performance in front of a large window that faced West 23rd Street. From there they could witness what seemed to be kidnappings, gangland shootouts, fires, and riotous behavior on the street, and they sometimes panicked when it spilled into the theater. It's no surprise that the Sun Ra Arkestra appeared in that theater on occasion. But the Arkestra was scary in a different way. White people had never seen black performers in such assertive, unpredictable roles, even though some of their performances, marching through the audience, the vocal call-and-response between the leader and the band, and musical battles among singers and musicians, had deep roots in church services and in earlier jazz. But black people, too, could find the band frightening, and even some of the orchestra's musicians feared what might be coming next. Not everyone got into the spirit of these space rituals. Some black musicians thought Ra was conning white people into taking him seriously. Others thought he was tomming, playing to whites' stereotypes. Closet high modernist jazz critics, like Nat Hentoff and Martin Williams, dismissed Ra's music as amateurish and his interviews as naive and embarrassing. But then bebop had embarrassed a lot of musicians, as did Dizzy Gillespie's introduction of Afro-Cuban drumming into bebop in the late 1940s, and the rule-changing appearance of free jazz in the 1960s. Such is the cost of an innovation in a music that's been labeled the sound of surprise. After seeing a number of the orchestra's performances, I felt an urge to write a biography of Sun Ra. He and I were both raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and had lived there at the same time. Years later, we were living a short distance away from each other in Philadelphia. If I didn't write it, I thought no one else would. That was slim grounds for writing a biography, I'll admit. What's worse, I had never given any thought to how biographies are written or what they were supposed to accomplish. When I did, it seemed to me that biographers work from letters and published texts, maybe audio and video sources, and that they interview those who knew the subject of the book. Timelines are constructed, events described, quotes inserted, and hopefully some order would come out of it all. If that was correct, Sun Ra was a bad choice for a beginning biographer. He denied being born. He actually abhorred the words birth and death. Said he and dates didn't get along, disallowed any earthly origins, and in fact rejected being human. Interviews with Ra were notorious for his evasiveness about details, as well as his use of the occasions to lecture the world about its evils. He also made it clear that jazz was a disguise for his message. His timeline, or timeless line, stretched between ancient Egypt, Alabama, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Saturn. Writing a biography under the best of circumstances is a chastening experience. Attempting to understand how another person lived takes you into places, people, histories, and ideas that are invariably unknown to you. What you thought you knew comes into question. Beyond the gossip, the press releases, the media quick takes, biographers, like anthropologists, find themselves in unfamiliar terrain. I think I was trying to rationalize my way into writing about someone who refused to be situated in a life by reminding myself that writing or reading about a life is never the way a life is lived. In real life, memory is fallible. Some things are forgotten, others remembered and given undue emphasis. Something said one day is different the next. What appears to be patterned, reliable, and inevitable in a biography is actually far sketchier and uncomfortably closer to fiction. A biography of Sun Ra would put all of this to the test. How was I to write about him when he already had a number of stories attached to him that were contradictory or highly improbable and dwelled on the mysterious? I was already put off by biographers who pretended to know what their subjects were thinking and covered themselves by using speculative past tenses like he might have known or she would have thought. I wanted to write as free of interpretation as possible, to be as objective as I could. I was already predisposed to that kind of writing from my background in anthropology, and I even wondered if it wouldn't be possible to write a bioethnography. So I tried to approach the Sun Ra Arkestra as an ethnographer, learning and writing from what the band members told me. I traveled with them when I could, spent a day a week with them for months, talking endlessly with as many of the members and former members as possible. I found that everyone in the band had a fascinating story, and the diversity of the group was surprising. One had been a member of a fearsome Chicago gang, the Blackstone Rangers. Another was a former student of the Yale School of Music who had been recruited by the composer Paul Hindemith. There were some older musicians who played at the highest level, and a few who seemed to have been added for other reasons. Some were true believers and others skeptics along for the music. But somehow they all cohered in a unique band that lasted for years, and through many changes of style and taste. I listened and absorbed Sun Ra's talk of space and non-human identity uncritically, attending to hints of arcane knowledge that could challenge the laws of nature. I didn't always understand it, but rather than try to confirm or debunk it, I took it as linguistic evidence and hoped that at a later date I could find parallels and analogues to Sun Ra's thought among other mystics and theologians. When I was given access to Sun Ra's library, I attempted to read as much of it as I could, following what he had read and the annotations he made. I read his poetry and listened to his lectures. It was a long and exhausting experience, but the education was worth the price. Looking back over my notes on my first visit to Sun Ra's house on Morton Street in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly shove, the home of the devil, as Sun Ra called it, the first thing I wrote down was that the window frames were tinted blue and the windows were covered with tin foil. On the stoop of the row house next door, a young girl was doing her homework. Across the street was a vacant lot, what remained of an old Germantown mansion, and the stump of a tree that I later learned had been struck by lightning and whose trunk was carved into the large thunder drum that always opened the Arkestra's shows. Inside, Sun Ra's front room was filled with state-of-the-art electronics, keyboards and computers, some of them broken. A large TV was tuned to a muted religious channel. There was a painting of members of the Arkestra emerging out of a jungle, done in the style of Henri Rousseau, maybe painted by Bob Thompson. Sun Ra's current reading was scattered about the room. Several issues of Popular Science, a book by a freed slave who reinterpreted history in light of spiritual X-ray, and the key writings of the Theosophists, many of whom had an affinity for the healing powers of music and embraced synesthesia and chromesthesia. I saw several volumes by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, an Alsatian theosophist, archaeologist, and an advocate of an alternative Egyptology. His belief was that the Egypt we know was the inheritor of the culture of another Egypt, an Ur-Egypt 25,000 years older, which was a more advanced and culturally oriented civilization, but one that had been flooded, and thus was the Atlantis of Plato. I gather that this was what scholars might call street-corner Egyptology, or crackpot archaeology. But I was captivated by it nonetheless. There were the works of 19th-century cultural diffusionists like Grafton Elliott Smith and William Perry, once important figures who now receive only a few paragraphs in anthropology texts as examples of heliocentrists who traced all cultures, Irish, Indonesian, Amerindian, German, whatever, to Egypt. Two large alternative Bibles were there. The Urantia book from 1955 and Oaspi, a new Bible, 1882, both of which had generated their own cults and attracted some famous followers among musicians. There was a Hebrew dictionary, a biblical concordance, and texts on hieroglyphics, etymologies, color therapy, and how to locate angels. Other books were on black folklore from the South, the travels of Livingstone, and anti-papal tracts that accused Catholics of being worshippers of Nimrod, a scarcely mentioned Old Testament figure who was believed to be black. Later I was to learn that Sun Ra was not just a voracious reader, but that he had developed his own way of reading, a different form of literacy, and one that I never fully understood. He could start reading anywhere in a text and stop anywhere, in the belief that all ideas are already in our brains and need only to be awakened. On the other hand, he considered English a language of duplicity, and he had found that many true words in the Bible had been distorted when they were first written, but their meanings could be revealed once they were read and then spoken aloud, so that the similarity of words that...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?